Recently, I was watching the Talk to a podcast with Jojo Siwa, and they had brought up the Teapot scandal of the 1920s. Haley had mentioned that it was primarily about oil leases, but then Jojo chimed in and made the point that it also involved significant construction contracts as part of building infrastructure for the drilling sites. I thought they both had made some great points, so I wanted to take a deep dive into the details of such a historic case of corruption. Make sure to like and subscribe, it'll really help the channel. In the early 20th century, the US Navy had begun switching the fuel supply for their ships from coal to oil. And to ensure that the Navy would have a steady supply, several areas rich in oil were designated as naval oil reserves by President William Howard Taft. These reserves included the Teapot Dome in Wyoming and two others in California, Elk Hills and Buena Vista. And these reserves were meant to be untouched until there was a national emergency. When Harding took office in 1921, his pro-business cabinet sought ways to transfer control of these valuable resources to private hands. He appointed Albert B. Fall, a former senator from New Mexico, as Secretary of the Interior. Fall, who was already deeply in debt, saw the oil reserves as his ticket out of financial ruin. But to take advantage of this opportunity, he needed to take control of the oil. Harding issued an executive order in 1921 transferring oversight of the oil reserves from the Navy to Fall's Department of Interior. This was a crucial moment in Fall's corrupt scheme, though it wouldn't take effect until the following year, when he convinced Navy Secretary Edwin Denby to implement it. Albert B. Fall, without question, is the main player in this scandal. His desire for wealth led him to secretly lease the Teapot Dome oil fields to Harry F. Sinclair, head of the Sinclair Oil Corporation, and the Elk Hills reserves to Edward L. Doheny of Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company. The deals were actually conducted without the required competitive bidding. While this practice technically was allowed under the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920, the nature of the transactions, hidden from public scrutiny, raised immediate suspicion. The terms of the leases were extremely favorable to Sinclair and Doheny. In exchange, Fall received $400,000 from Sinclair, which today is equivalent to almost $7 million, and a no-interest loan of $100,000 from Doheny, which comes out to about $1.7 million in today's terms. These gifts, or as everyone else calls them, bribes, made Fall a very, very rich man overnight. For a time, Fall's dealings went unnoticed. The leases were legal on paper, and Fall even justified them as necessary for national defense, arguing that allowing private companies to extract the oil would ensure the Navy's access to fuel in an emergency. However, behind the scenes, the personal enrichment of Fall was becoming increasingly harder to hide. He made significant improvements to his ranch, paid off years and years of overdue taxes, and lived far beyond his previously strained means. It was Carl McGee, an investigative journalist, who first raised public alarm. McGee, the founder of Albuquerque Tribune, noticed Fall's newfound wealth and began connecting the dots. Simultaneously, an angry oilman in Wyoming, shut out from the lucrative Teapot Dome deal, wrote to his senator, John B. Kendrick, complaining about the secret lease to Sinclair. And this was the catalyst. On April 15th, 1922, Kendrick called for an investigation on the Teapot Dome lease. While initial investigations went nowhere, the matter caught the attention of Senator Thomas J. Walsh of Montana, who would relentlessly pursue the case for 2 years. At first, Fall appeared to be untouchable. He had covered his tracks pretty good so far, and despite Walsh's inquiries, the lease seemed above board. But one thing troubled Walsh. How had Fall, a man with severe financial struggles, suddenly become so wealthy? As Walsh continued his investigation, crucial evidence that Fall had tried to conceal began to emerge. Fall's ultimate downfall came when Walsh uncovered proof of the $100,000 loan from Doheny. This loan was delivered in cash in a suitcase. Come on! That's textbook bribery 101, and that was the smoking gun Walsh needed. The investigation blew wide open, and the public was outraged as more details surfaced about the secret oil leases and the blatant bribery that had transpired. By 1924, the scandal had reached its peak. While Fall had resigned from his position in 1923, the damage was done. Walsh had already brought the case before the Senate, leading to a cascade of civil and criminal cases, and these lawsuits would drag on throughout the decade. The Supreme Court eventually ruled in 1927 that the oil leases were corruptly obtained, invalidating the deals and returning the oil reserves to the U.S. Navy. In 1929, Fall was finally convicted of accepting bribes from Doheny, being the very first U.S. cabinet member to be sentenced to prison. And with all the lies, corruption, scheming, taxpayer money wasted through trials and trials, we finally got a conviction, and he served a whopping 1 year. 1 year? That's it? If you do secretive underground deals that eliminates all the competition and goes against the federal law, and you make millions off of the behind the door deal, you only get 1 year in prison? But if you steal $5,000, you get 5 years in prison. Huh? And Sinclair, who orchestrated much of the deal with Fall, was convicted of contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate with the investigation and for tampering with the jury. So he has contempt and jury tampering, and he got 6 months in jail. And Doheny, whatever, he said his $100,000 loan wasn't a bribe, and he was actually acquitted on the charges. So, okay, he's free to go. The Teapot Dome scandal severely damaged the reputation of the Harding administration. His hands-off approach allowed things like the Teapot scandal to go unchecked. The scandal actually did end up having a profound impact on American politics. It exposed the dangers of government and private sector collusion, and in 1924, Congress passed permanent legislation giving itself subpoena power over tax records of any U.S. citizen, regardless of their position in government. Which I don't know why they didn't have in the first place. I think you'd want to kind of know the tax records of anyone in a high position of power. Fallout from the Teapot Dome contributed to the strengthening of the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, which ultimately regulates campaign finances. The scandal also solidified the necessary transparency in government dealings, particularly in the management of public resources like oil and natural gas. For decades, the Teapot Dome scandal was considered one of the most significant cases for the government corruption in U.S. history, often referred to as the high-level watermark for cabinet corruption. And it wasn't until 50 years later, when the Watergate scandal happened, that the public eyes finally shifted from one corruption to the next. The Teapot Dome oil fields laid idle for nearly 50 years after the scandal. By the time the production had ceased again in 2015, the field had already produced over $560 million worth of oil. That same year, the U.S. Department of Energy sold the Teapot Dome field to a private company, finally closing the book on one of America's most infamous scandals. The lessons of the Teapot Dome scandal remain relevant today. A reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the vital importance of transparency, accountability, and ethical governance.